You're listening to Mike Adams and Chris Savory, the record collectors from the BBC.
Well, our special guest tonight on the Record Collectors is Donovan. Welcome to the programme, Donovan.
Thank you. I'm feeling very welcome indeed.
Right in the middle of your British tour. We're in the heart of the Cavern Club in Liverpool at the moment, which of course has memories to rock fans throughout the world. My first question is, you've lived in Scotland, Ireland, the United States, down south and many other places, including Cornwall. What do you regard now as home?
I'm now living in Ireland, the southern part of Ireland in the County Cork. And you know, it's always been a spiritual and a musical home for me. I was born in Glasgow originally. My mother's side were Irish parents, my father's side was Scottish. And so we're living down there in a town, near a town called Mallow, and we're very comfortable in Ireland.
The marvellous thing about your songwriting is that virtually everything about your lyrics seems to come directly from the heart. And most of them appear to be about personal issues, or are they just fiction?
No, it's a means of expression. I'm the first one to hear the songs I write, and they tend to come from my own experience. I have written about other experiences, and I do like being given a lyric from another poet and putting music to it, and of course that's their experience, but generally all my songs come from my observations or my personal life.
Anything that particularly is poignant to you, that's perhaps a very early experience that's affected your writing?
Well, you know, to go way back to the beginning, my father read me poetry of visionaries like Byron and Shelley, and especially Burns, because he was a Scot. But he also read me poetry of Lewis Carroll, the nonsense poetry of Edward Lear. And my father was of this ilk who he was part of the Celtic tradition to be able to memorize great wads of poetry, and he read it to me and taught me the lyrical balance of a poem very early, from a very early age, although he wasn't a singer. Early experiences listening to folk music of Scotland must have kindled something in me, and I've always felt responsible for a tradition in the ballad form of my songwriting, and so I suppose I'm from the Celtic tradition, and a very, very responsible feeling of coming from this tradition, which includes, as you know, the Irish, Scottish and Welsh traditions of poetry and song. But all over Northern Europe, before the Romans came, there was a tradition of the minstrel. I feel I'm part of that, and it's reflected in my songs.
Are you a believer in the Druid traditions and Druid culture at all?
Well, any close examination of the songs that I sing of nature, you could relate it to the early Celtic poetry, which in a way is very similar to Japanese poetry, which praises nature. So I was a very early green songwriter. The Druid, we don't know much about the Druid faith, but it was always part of my search in the books that I have, and I have a library full of Celtic mythology and Celtic poetry, looking for what did they believe in? Well, if they believed like other pagan tribal societies, they believed that the earth was something to be worshipped and it was feminine. And so, in a way, I'm more a pagan than a Christian.
Often they make their tombs in the way of hills and long barrows, and they try to emulate the earth, didn't they, in when people died, and revere them in some natural sort of way.
Yeah, very much. That is very much the philosophy of the afterlife, and they buried their chieftains that way. There was always in the Celtic warrior, the soldiers, that they were very, very rarely scared of warfare, because they knew when they died that they would go up to heaven, into the Celtic otherworld. And the Celtic philosophies are very mysterious. They're very popular now, but they're very mysterious. And the hills and the stones of Britain, they're presumably are on magic spots, and old Christian churches were built on ancient Celtic tombs. That's true.
Well, often you find a burial mound or a hill which looks for excavation very close to where the church was. If the poets and the Celtic origins were influenced to you, any modern songwriters or singers that influenced you in the 60s?
Well, starting in the late 50s, I became aware of the American folk revival, especially the songs of Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger. Then I became aware of other songwriters, particularly in America, Buffy Sainte-Marie, and who could not be influenced by the arrival of Bob Dylan, who showed us all, early before I began, how to popularize our lyrics in a very strong way. Other songwriters, Joni Mitchell, Leonard Cohen, and then when we get into the pop world, I find that I was very influenced by the very simplistic lyrics of Buddy Holly. And certain sounds that you hear in my vocal renditions on the records, where you can hear the influence of Buddy Holly. Many songwriters were influential to me, but in particular when I heard the songs of the Beatles, especially Love Me Do, which is a very simplistic song, but there was a harmonica in it, and I wanted to place harmonica in my tracks too, from the Woody Guthrie days and then later the Dylan days. And so I was absorbing all kinds of songwriting.
You've played with and performed with some of the greatest artists of this century, and some would say that the musicians were the poets of the 20th century. What are your favourite artists, and any memories of those artists that we can tell?
Well, in the beginning, Jimmy Page didn't have Zeppelin, and he was a session guy, even after he did the Yardbirds. And I was a great fan of the early rhythm and blues bands, the Yardbirds and the Rolling Stones. As I started playing with Jimmy, I also was becoming aware, through John Cameron, the great arranger, who worked with me and Mickey Mouse, the producer, I became very much aware that there were fine jazz musicians, and one in particular, Danny Thompson, who was the bass player most celebrated in the Pentangle group. But Danny Thompson had played with everybody, and that upright bass was very influential on my music. I was then very, very delighted to be able to play with Jeff Beck on the song Varabajago, another great guitar player. I didn't play with Clapton, but I knew him briefly over the years. George Harrison, although we never cut records, we played in India quite a lot, and he was very influential in introducing me to the Indian instruments when we spent that 7 weeks in India together. I had passed on songwriting techniques on the guitar through the fingerstyles of the folk music, and George had returned to me the Indian instruments. So there was a great coming and going of influences. Other musicians that would have influenced me over the years, and not particularly the 60s, although Ray Davies of the Kinks was very, very encouraging when I heard his songwriting. Full, well-made songs with that wonderful lyrical style he has. Billie Holiday was a great influence. Jazz in general was a great influence.
What I will do is we'll play a track off a new compact disc which is being distributed throughout the UK. I'll give our listener the full details a bit later. Of the 3 tracks, what would you like us to play?
Well, this is a collector's item, I suppose. It's in particular, there's one on here, Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon.
And here it is. Was Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon from our special guest on the Record Collectors tonight, Donovan. Now, we mentioned the Maharishi. Now, our listeners are big fans, quite a few of them are big fans of Lennon and McCartney and that whole era. Those 7 weeks have been written about and rewritten about and talked about by pontificators, people who thought they knew about it, but you were there. What are your memories of that visit to India?
Well, it was quite amazing. I was invited by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi to join him in the ashram for a series of weeks of study of meditation. I was delighted because there were no teachings that you could really find in Europe regarding meditation at the time. He initiated me in Los Angeles. The Beatles were initiated in Bangor, in England, and I found myself on a plane arriving in India, which was an amazing experience. On Air India, I arrived there to find not only 4 Beatles, but Paul Horn, the jazz flautist, Mia Farah, the actress, and a group of people that had come there to spend 7 weeks studying. For me, it was amazing. It was not only a spiritual experience and an introduction to a form of meditation that I hadn't learned before, but it was also a musical first, to be able to hang out with the finest jazz flute player in the world, Paul Horn. Mike Love of the Beach Boys was there, but I don't remember Mike playing much. And 4 Beatles, especially George and John and Paul, who were guitar players that I revered, and songwriters, which was an amazing situation to be locked away for 7 weeks at the height of their success and the height of my success in the 60s. In a way, it was like a summer camp. It was like a Butlins, but Indian style. We ate vegetarian food. Monkeys would jump on the breakfast table and steal our food. Peacocks could be heard flying through the jungle at night, and elephants calling into the night. We were locked away, and the world's press were outside trying to get in. Through this whole period, I got to know George, and I got to know Paul and John, and in particular, I got to know myself. I wrote songs which would end up on various albums over the years, and it was a magnificent experience. At the end of the whole affair, I didn't have the same experience as the Beatles. It would seem that they left with some disappointment. I didn't have that disappointment. There was something that went on which didn't affect me. It would seem that maybe Maharishi had crossed the line between teacher and pupil with some of the Beatles' wives. Do you know, I don't really know what happened. It's something to do with their own experience there. But I stayed on a little bit longer, and then I had to go, and arrived back in England and took up the 60s where I'd left off.
Well, I'm sure that's answered quite a few questions for our listener. Your career, if one goes right back to the very beginning, one thinks of Cornwall, and you were working in Cornwall, and indeed playing in a club or a pub in St Ives. And on this very tour, you're going back to St Ives. Any memories of those Cornish days?
Well, very much early memories in those summers of 62 and 3 when young people from all over Britain would take to the roads and hitchhike down into Devon and Cornwall, and we'd arrive there on the beaches, and I arrived there that early summer of 62, and I was learning guitar and sleeping rough, and at one point I was learning enormous amount of songs from other folk singers. That was my heyday of the hitchhiking, because the sun was shining, the sea was there, and I started writing these songs with the images of the sea and the seagulls and the rocks and the seashells, and I was very much involved in marine biology, it seems. But also we were having fun.
Belgium in that, was it?
Yeah, Epistle to
Darrell.
Darrell he was a banjo player who I must mention, because in my book I'm going to be talking about the influence of Darrell Adams. He was like the second Pete Seeger in the American folk tradition. And Darrell taught me a lot of stuff on banjo. And at that point, down there in Cornwall, I started writing songs of the sea. Later on, I wrote this song for Darrell, and it was called Epistle to Darrell.
The song Darrell, the epistle of, I gather when you became famous, you decided to acknowledge him because he introduced the banjo and that kind of playing to you, but to remember him. But sometimes when you become very famous, it does actually separate you from friends, but you remembered him in the song.
Yeah, I wanted to keep in touch, and I've written another song called Epistle to Dippy, who was a school friend. And so there is a way through the airwaves that I was able to contact people. If I wasn't able to spend the time with them, I could write a poem, and that they would spend time with the poem and know what I felt.
Is there anybody you've not worked with that you'd like to work with in the future?
Well, and funnily enough, I've become aware in the last few years of a singer-songwriter, producer called Daniel Lenoir, who's from New Orleans. He's just recently produced U2, before that Dylan. But he's got his own album out, and a wonderful album it is too. And he's got all the French side of the Celtic music that he's brought into the New Orleans songs that he writes and he plays. So Daniel Lenoir I'd like to work with. Who haven't I played with? Lots of people I haven't played with. Julian Bream, before he passes into the other world, I'd like to play with him. And I've got something that I'd like to send him that I'd like to play with. Other musicians, fine musicians are everywhere, and I'd love to play with a lot more, but I won't get round to it.
Well, I hope we have more tours. It's been too long. And on behalf of us, Donovan, thank you for the wonderful music. And here's to the next album, and here's some more of your music.
Thank you.